Thank you very much for joining us tonight here at the Dearborn Public Library. We'll be talking with Susan Morrison on her new book, Lorne, the Man Who Invented Saturday Night Live. But first, a couple announcements. The format for tonight, I'll be talking with Ms. Morrison for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A session for about 10 minutes or so. And then we got for our upcoming programs, we'll be talking with the author of the book on the federal judge, Gerald Rosen, on his book on the bankruptcy of the city of Detroit, the bankruptcy process. That'll be on April 30th. So please join us then. You can sign up for a Zoom link on our library website. So I'm very pleased that Ms. Morrison is joining us tonight. She is the articles editor at the New Yorker magazine. She is a former editor-in-chief of the New Yorker Observer and one of the original editors at Spy magazine. So please welcome Susan Morrison.
Hi, nice to be here.
So when you were young, did you think of yourself, hey, I want to be a writer?
I never did. I was always quite a reader as a young person, even though I grew up in a house without a lot of books. There wasn't a lot of reading in my family, but I like to read. But when I started my career as an editor, I always I really liked being an editor for 40 years. Many editors have a secret hankering to write. And I just never did. I mean, I saw how hard it was. I saw how my writers suffered through it and sweated it. And I always liked the more big picture aspect of being an editor, being able to put together a whole issue of a magazine, think about the mix, help a writer bring a piece into being and polish it and make it better. And so this kind of came out of the blue for me. And one of the things that's made the success of this book so especially lovely for me is I don't know that many people who, publish their first writing project, the same month that they're applying for Medicare. So it, it feels good.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. So what does an articles editor do? Is it copy editing
No,
or
no, no, no.
what?
I mean, our titles here at the New Yorker are strange because we don't have a masthead, and the titles are almost made up. They don't really mean much. David Remnick is the editor-in-chief, and then there are like three of us who have been here for many, many years who are kind of like the next level of editors. We're like the Politburo. It's me and Dan Zalewski and Henry Finder. And we're kind of the second level editors. I edit the talk of the town section, which are the short pieces in the front of the magazine, all of the humor pieces, a lot of different kinds of cultural pieces. I love a lot of writers whose work I always edit, and I edit special issues and oversee assigning pieces because when you put out a magazine every week, it's quite a job just to keep the pipeline full. So a lot of effort is put into coming up with the ideas for the stories, figuring out which writers should write them, keeping that whole process moving along.
So you talk to writers, maybe have a few in mind, say, hey, can you do this story? Or
Yeah, there's a lot of matchmaking. Somebody will say, "Oh, why don't we do a story about some aspect of the recovery from the Palisades fires?" And you'll think, "Okay, well, who do we have out there?" And just call people on the phone, and it's sort of like putting together a dinner party, just figuring out who
yeah.
can do what in what amount of time. And so you have a lot of different textures and voices in each issue.
Now you've obviously read very talented writers about in your work as the Observer at Spy Magazine and now the New Yorker. When you sat down to write this book, did you have that any of those writers that you read influenced you?
Oh, sure. I mean, the writing part, that was really hard because what I typically do is I'll take a, a manuscript, sometimes just fiddle with it, but sometimes you're really rewriting the thing from top to bottom. But it's still, you have words on the page that you're working with. When you're starting with a blank page, it's a whole other story. Um, because I'm an editor and have been an editor all my life, one of the difficulties for me was just writing a paragraph and then moving on to the next paragraph, feeling satisfied with it. In the beginning, I was just taking too long, trying to make everything perfect. And then one of my writers, Tad Friend, said, no, no, you can't do it that way. You'll never finish it. You have to produce what's called a vomit draft, which is just you put everything, all your material down on the page. You just put it all out there, even if it's long and unwieldy. And then you can go back at it with your editor's hat on, which is what you really know how to do, and shape it. And so that's what I did. And it's true that I would get stuck sometimes. Sometimes I felt like as I was writing, my paragraphs were just kind of like stacked lumber. And what I would do then would be to stop and just think about some of the really, beautiful, excuse me, sentences by writers that I love working with the most, Nick Paumgarten, Ian Parker, Tad Friend, Rebecca Mead. And I definitely have absorbed, just by osmosis, a lot of the rhythms and writing tricks of the talented people that I've worked with all these years.
Well, I can relate to the idea of that it's like a puzzle, or at least I approach writing like a puzzle. You
Yeah,
fit you fit pieces together so it flows. So,
right.
but how did no, you didn't. How did you come up with the idea for the book?
Well, about 10 years ago, after SNL had its big 40th anniversary show and celebrated 40 years on the air, I started thinking about how what an important influence Lorne Michaels has been. The one person has stayed in that job all that time, uh, helping determine what generations of Americans find funny. Really the one guy who sort of knows what has made people laugh for all this time. I knew Lorne very slightly because I worked for him in 1984 on a show that he did that was his one spectacular public failure. It was a primetime variety show called The New Show. And, I moved to journalism right after that, but I did get to know a lot of the comedy writers who would go on to work for Lorne for the next 40 years and stayed in touch with a lot of those people. And many of them have written for me through my career, people like Steve Martin and Jack Handy. And so I've been hearing writers and comedy people talk about Lorne Michaels and how peculiar and inscrutable and unknowable he was for years. And after the 40th anniversary show, I just thought, wow, here's this super interesting guy who's been kind of hiding in plain sight. He rarely talked to the press. He he just, kept very private. So I just decided he'd be a great subject. And I also knew enough about him to know that if I went to him and asked if I could write his biography, he would probably say, no, I'm not interested in that because he likes to be the guy behind the curtain. So the way I approached it was, I knew a lot of people in his world. I knew that scene. So I wrote a book proposal. I had a real point of view on Lorne, and my agent sent it around, and I was surprised when there was massive interest and a big bidding war ensued. And I ended up signing a contract with Random House. I had not promised that I would have Lorne Michaels' involvement in the project. So after that, I just went to see him at his office, and I said, Lorne, I've just sold a book about you and the show. I don't need anything from you, but if you want to sit down and talk to me about it, about your life in the show, it'll be a richer book and a better book. And, a better reflection of your legacy. And he doesn't like surprises. He likes to be in control.
No,
He's a producer.
no.
So he looked stricken, to put it mildly. And, we talked a little bit more. I still didn't know what was going to happen, but a few days later, we met for a drink. And again, I thought we were going to be, start negotiating over what, how much did he want this? How much time would he give me? But he pretty much just started telling stories. So that was it. We were just off and running, and he asked for nothing in return. He didn't want any control. He didn't want to approve anything. And we just had a very good rapport. And I interviewed him, about 50 times over the next few years, and spent a lot of time at the show, and also just interviewed all of his people. I mean, it took a long time because there are a lot of people who've gone through SNL, and he knows a lot of people.
Well, yeah, one of the things that come apparent through the book is family.
Yes.
He and that was described very well, and when you described things very well on how he grew up in Toronto. Being here in Detroit, going over to Windsor, and being in Canada is like second nature. We watch the CBC all the time. Yeah, you do. So it's you understand it, and he was the death of his father really made an impression on him.
Yes. Yeah, yeah. Well, first of all, he talked to me about how comedy kind of comes, was a natural byproduct of growing up in Canada where it was very cold and very boring, and you had to try to make your own entertainment and make your own fun.
Yeah.
Um, and he also liked to watch the American channels when they arrived on the CBC. And he was always tortured by the fact that you'd see commercials for wonderful looking candy bars like Milky Way and Snicker bars and Snickers. And then at the end of it, a big sign would come on the screen that said not available in Canada. And
Oh,
that kind of
geez.
whetted his appetite to get across the border. But yes, when he was 14 years old, his father died suddenly. And his mother went into a depression, and his whole world really became somewhat bleak. He started struggling in school, and it started this period of, I think he leaned on comedy to try to cheer up his mother, who was very down. Um, he 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 became the kind of person who, um, avoided confrontation. He didn't like emotional displays. It sort of shaped his personality in a lot of ways that would go on to inform how he worked as a producer.
Yeah, it was it was remarkable how he uh, developed his producing skills. He produced all these shows in summer camp. Who does that? And
Yeah, I
uh,
remember talking to a guy who later became a friend of Lawrence, a guy named, oh my goodness, how come I be forgetting his name? He's a guy from Michigan who went on to found a clothing company called Roots. And he told me that when he was in camp in Michigan, he's around Lauren's age, they, they all had heard of Lorne Lipowitz from Toronto, who put on such great shows at Camp Timberlane. So even in the camp in the camp circuit, he was famous even when he was like 15 years old at knowing how to put on a good show at summer camp. But yes, he did the shows at school, and he was a counselor at camp, and he just kind of learned a bit of it every single place he went.
but he was always struggling with the Canadian uh, uh, being Canadian. Uh, my wife and I were once in a line to get the train back here to Detroit from Toronto, and the other line I could see a mom and little son said, Mama saying to the son, "Now we're going to America, and they're going to want to talk to you, but you don't be quiet." And it just it was a struggle because he wanted to go out to Hollywood to get into show business, but he was like being pulled.
Yes.
Like,
Yeah, he was influenced a lot by Wayne and Schuster, this comic duo who lived in his neighborhood, and they were the guests on the Ed Sullivan Show more often than any other act. And even though they were huge stars in Canada, they never gave in to the lure of Hollywood. They never moved to California or to New York. And Lorne really admired that. And for a period, he thought that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to be successful but stay in Toronto. But that it didn't end up happening that way. Incidentally, to backtrack a minute, when you were talking about, you know, going back and forth from Detroit into Canada, I wanted to say that a lot of that part of the book, um, observations about living near Canada and living near the American border I got a lot of help from my dear friend Bruce McCall, the Canadian illustrator and writer who contributed more covers to the New Yorker, I think, than any other artist, who died a few years ago. And Bruce has written a couple of different wonderful memoirs about growing up in provincial Canada, one called On Thin Ice, and then there was another one a few years ago whose name is escaping me. But those are great books, just that both, talk about the funny relationship, coastal relationship between, or borderline relationship between Canada and the US.
oh, thank you. Yeah, I'll have to check them out because yeah, that's definitely. I mean, it's second nature. Uh,
Mm.
uh, but the no, he went to Hollywood and he found it not a great place for a writer. I guess that's the best way to put it. He,
Right. Yeah, Lorne, he was young. It was the 60s. He was really excited by the counterculture and rock and roll. And, he had loved Mike Nichols, The Graduate. So when he went to California, he thought he was going to be right in the middle of all of that. The Summer of Love was happening up in San Francisco. But what he found, which was a huge disappointment to him, was that television was kind of lagging way behind the other art forms. His first job was working on a show called The Beautiful Phyllis Diller Show. And Phyllis Diller was a brilliant comedian, a little kind of back sort of refugee from the 50s, I would say, who wore a fright wig and did all this kind of goofy Catskills kind of comedy. But Lorne arrived for his first day on the show, and all the other writers were guys in their 50s and 60s. They were a completely different generation. They had started out in radio. And so it was a huge culture clash to him. He thought that it was going to be some cutting edge scene, and instead it was a lot of old guys. But Lorne, being the kind of person that he was and is, which is a person who always wants to get the best out of something, always find something redeeming in any situation, he realized, like, okay, these guys might be a lot older than I am, but they must have some things to teach me. And it turned out, one of these guys had written for Jack Benny, who was a hero of Lorne's. A couple of them were writers on the original I Love Lucy show. And so they took Lorne under their wing, and they would give him old scripts and show him how jokes should look on a page and what the beats would be. Uh, he told me that the Jack Benny radio scripts, which he studied, tirelessly, were strangely short. They were just a few sheets of paper because so much of Benny's comedy was about pauses, you know.
wow,
So,
yeah.
even though he was in this exciting hip city, but worked with these kind of older, graying, you know, writers, he found something to take away from it. He found something to learn. And his other jobs in the beginning, then he went from there to the Perry Como Christmas special. And that wasn't a lot hipper, but uh, he did find something. He found interesting people in each of these places. And then he finally ended up at Laugh-In, which was, unlike these other shows, a big hit, which was kind of exciting. And yet, there he was also disappointed because the writers at Laugh-In worked out of a motel room miles from the studio. You know, they were not part of the glamour. There were not read-throughs. They didn't interact with the talent. Um, Lorne described it as, you know, they would sit in this motel room together and just crank out jokes. It's like a sausage factory. And, you know, then they'd give the jokes to the head writer. He would take them over to the studio. They'd be rewritten a few more times. And, you know, the only way you would know if any of your material got on the air was to watch the show on Monday night. And, you know, maybe you'd see a glimmer of one of your gags. But that was, you know, he said it was sort of like shoveling coal in the, you know, below decks in an ocean liner while a wild party is going on the deck. And uh but again, the thing that he took away from that was when he did eventually have a show of his own, Saturday Night Live, he made sure that the writers were one of the most important parts of the show. The SNL really elevates the writer. The writer is almost more important than the cast there. And you know, writers write their sketches and they direct them, they figure out the costumes and the sets. You know, they basically are like mini producers on their own sketches. So that was the good takeaway from Laugh-In. Like, don't treat the writer like the bottom of the totem pole.
Yeah, yeah. So the first show, Saturday Night Live show, is 1975, and I believe it's Herb Schlosser.
Hmm.
He really, he was the guy who really made it, made it happen or make it happen, I guess. Uh,
Yes, Herb Schlosser was a young president of NBC, was really a visionary guy. Even before he came up with the idea for SNL, he was one of the first network presidents who was interested in putting people of color on television. You know, he greenlit Sanford and Son. He put Julia, starring Diane Carroll, on the air. He was a big fan of Richard Pryor. He put on the Flip Wilson show. So he was really, you know, he was kind of a visionary in that world. And in 1975, he was looking for something to fill a slot at 11:30 at night on Saturday, a time when most other TV programmers considered, you know, they considered that just to be a wasteland, to be like nothing worth, you know, not worth any revenue or anything. And it turned out to be just the kind of slot that was perfect for the show that young Lorne Michaels had in his head, because the stakes were very low. People weren't really paying attention. You could almost use it as a laboratory, you know. Lorne always told people that he wanted his show to look like a bunch of kids had come into the studio after the grown-ups had gone home.
And there's a certain, it developed a certain schedule during the week. Uh, like each day had its own function. Like uh, Monday, like introducing. Tuesday was for had the writing all night, and then the read through on Wednesday. It really, and it hasn't changed in 50 years.
No, that's right. It's you know, one of the long-term head writers of the show, Jim Downey, likes to say that if you got a group of Swiss engineers together and you told them, okay, here are all the things that have to happen to put the show together, they would look at it and they'd say, okay, you need about 11 days for that. But they have 6 days, you know, and they just do it in 6 days. And it's like a train on a track. It's very regimented every week. You know, everything has its own time slot. And one of the things that was fun for me and that I think helps make the book fun to read is that I spent 1 week at the show. Basically, just every minute that Lorne was there, I was sort of at his elbow. And so there's a structural thing in the book where the first chapter of the book is Monday at the show. So you're really in the room with all these people. It feels almost a little bit more like a magazine article than a biography. And then chapter two is 1944 in Toronto, where Lorne is watching television and wishing for Milky Ways and Snicker bars. And so, the days of the week propel the book. You go through they're all through the book leading up to Saturday, which is a real nail biter of a day, and you see how stressful it is. And one of the reasons, I was happy with that I came up with that structure for a couple of reasons. One is, as you just said, it really shows a reader how the show is put together and how each day has its own schedule and its own set of tasks. But I think it also prevents the book from getting bogged down in something that can make biographies sometimes feel kind of heavy and schematic. When you're going through somebody's life, phrase I use sometimes, it can feel like a death march through the years, this year and then that year and then the next year. And so this breaks it all up and gives the book this kind of forward drive.
Well, you see uh, what happens in the past, how it applies in the future.
Right, right. It's almost, yes, there's an interweaving of the times.
And I love the section in the book, Lawrence Rules of Comedy. Uh,
Oh yeah. No, I've worked as a magazine editor for 40 years, and I've learned that any story about, somebody who's really good at what they do, where they've distilled, how to be good at their job into little nuggets of wisdom, people just love that. People love rules, people love lists. And so it was so fun to just, one after another. I mean, almost every day that I was with Lorne, I would hear another one of these things. And some of them are rules of comedy, rules of sketch writing. And some of them are just rules on, advice on how to live your life, because a lot of the people who work for Lorne are very young. They're in their 20s. They've moved to New York City, maybe from Oklahoma. They don't know their way around. And he likes to give life advice. In the 70s, the advice he gave the cast members might be something along the lines of, rotate your drugs,
yeah,
But now he gives people advice on, how to buy their first apartment and where to go on vacation. And more than one cast member told me that they'd heard him say, what's better than 10-foot ceilings? 12-foot ceilings. So he likes them to live the good life. But the comedy rules are also really interesting. And once you start thinking about his comedy rules, every time you watch the show, you think about them. And one of the ones that he says most often is the phrase, do it in sunshine. And what he means by that is that you have to always remember that people come to comedy for entertainment. They want it to be sunny, they want to laugh, they want it to be uplifting. And, he counsels the writers against like writing anger. Like people don't want to watch people screaming at each other on TV. People don't want to see coffins on TV. Or, some of the young writers gravitate toward kind of gritty indie scenarios. And I'll just say you want it to be light, you want it to be pleasant. Um, and one benchmark of that is, if you think about, I realize that if you look at all of the movies that Lorne has produced, and he's produced a lot of comedies, almost all of them follow the same rule in terms of what their movie posters look like. If you think about the Wayne's World poster, it's Wayne and Garth standing in front of a blue sky on a sunny day with fluffy white clouds. And that's also the poster for Coneheads and, a dozen other movies that he's produced. Cabin Boy. What's the one? I can't remember the the great one with Chris Farley and well, anyway,
oh, Tommy Boy.
yes, yeah. And so, he wants it to be upbeat and light. And let's see, another one, which is a similar kind of thing, is you can't hide behind art. And what he means by that is you don't want to make it too precious or too arty. You just want to make it funny.
Well, you also talked about how, and well, he would talking with him probably take a lot to understand because he talks and I think you referred to as if you're following up on a previous
Yeah.
conversation, or you were use the word cones, Koan. Uh,
Yes, he does like to talk, and people love to listen to him. And partly some of it is he has a lot of old show business stories, that he heard when he was a little boy from Frank Schuster, around the corner from him. And he just loves to tell old stories about Lou Wasserman or Pamela Harriman or James Dean. And again, there's usually a little lesson in these stories. Everyone who works for him has heard him tell these stories a dozen times and they've learned things from them. So, but occasionally he'll say something and everyone afterward will be like puzzling out, what does he mean by that? What does that mean? One that a lot of people have told me stumped them goes like this. He'll say, you have to decide whether you're going to be the person who builds the house or the person who buys the house. It's like, what the hell does that mean? I don't
yeah.
know. But it's testament to the power he has over all of these creative people that they spend hours trying to figure him out. They compare him to the Wizard of Oz or Obi-Wan Kenobi or Tom Ripley. He's this powerful, mysterious person who holds all of their fates in his hands.
Well, yeah, you talk about different people doing auditions, and they weren't sure if they were on the show or not.
Right. Well, another one of his rules is he doesn't like, any of his people to laugh when other people come in to audition. Auditioners know that they're going to audition in a cold room, meaning no one laughs, because he thinks it throws off the performer and that the other performers waiting to audition backstage, they'll hear that laughter and it will, disorient them. I've been to some of the auditions and everyone just sits there kind of straight faced. So, yeah, I mean, if you're auditioning, you can't tell how well you've done. And then even sometimes after you audition, you might be called in to have a meeting with Lorne, and he'll just start asking you unrelated questions like what you've read lately, you know, where'd you go to high school? And people walk out of that office and they're like, they have no idea if they've got a job or not. Because yeah, he's mysterious.
Well, it's also imitating them every bit and play and like the writers do riffs on
Yes.
his imitations and various cast members do probably most famously Mike Myers and Austin Powers do imitations of him. So it has to be some uh, uh, imitations are usually a positive thing, or at least with affection.
Yes, I think that for the writers, and mostly the writers and the cast who do this, it's sort of a pressure valve, because the show is a very high pressure environment. Often they're writing all night long, they're stressed. Um, and it's sort of like improv, they're riffing with each other and they're trying to make each other laugh to defuse the tension. And the way they regard Lorne, it's a funny mixture of reverence and fear. Um, and they also, like to make fun of him a little bit because he's the sort of big mogully rich guy who, they work for. And, a lot of the caricatures of him have to do with this notion of him being just off somewhere on a yacht with a lot of fancy rich people while they're, sitting in the office in the middle of the night eating Big Macs trying to churn out comedy. But it's affectionate, and he is wise enough to understand that it is he takes it as homage, and he also likes to say it's the most American thing there is to make fun of the boss And then he also says, because he's funny, he says they don't do it that much in Canada because in Canada nobody's that successful.
Yeah, they're just too polite to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, he is a character
Mm.
now in the different skits.
No, that's right. He has made these cameo appearances on the show from the very beginning. In the first season, the really famous one that launched this was when he came out as Lorne Michaels, the producer, and made a very serious offer to the Beatles to reunite on the show because there had been talk at that time of the Beatles reuniting. People were offering them $50 million to do so. And Lorne held up a check and said that NBC has authorized me to offer you $3,000. And it was just this very deadpan, very funny thing. And over the years, he has reprised this role, this producer character, who's a straight man, very Jack Benny. And I think that, and that is a little bit like who the real Lorne is, but it's slightly exaggerated. And I think that by this time, 50 years on, that character is as much of a recognizable character on the show as like the church lady or Rosanna Dana or, Hans and Franz or any of the beloved recurring characters that we're all used to seeing. I remember asking Alec Baldwin when I interviewed him, I said, who do you think does the best Lorne impersonation? And he took a beat and he said, Lorne.
That I was fascinated by how the Studio 8H is a big place, and I was fascinated how the different where the different skits are placed in the studio makes so much of a difference. Meaning your reference to Dana Carvey's church.
Yes. Yes, and what's interesting is, so if you're watching at home, you just see the sketch on the TV. You don't have a sense of where it is in the studio, but the studio is this huge rectangle, and with like 6 or 7 different stages on it, and one of the stages that's known as home base is right in the middle. Everyone sitting in the studio audience can see it, but some of them are kind of tucked underneath the audience seats. Some of them are in distant corners. And so if you're doing a sketch, Dana Carvey really understood this. So when he wrote a sketch, he would get the designers on his side and they would put his sketch at home base because he knew that then the audience could look right into his eyes. He could see the audience, he could hear them. And, you know, you want the studio audience to be laughing because that just gives the sketch much more juice. And then that means that you watching at home in your living room, you're going to see a kind of more exciting sketch than a sketch that is tucked way away in the corner and has made nobody in the studio audience laugh.
Yeah, yeah. The especially again being here in Detroit, I picked up the Kids in the Hall when they
Oh, yeah.
started being shown on CBC, and I was very surprised that Lorne had a great hand in their success.
Yes, in 1985, he hired 2 of the kids, Mark McKinney and Bruce McCulloch, to be writers on the show. So he got to know them that way. And then after that year, he went up to Toronto and saw the Kids in the Hall perform at the Rivoli, which was this little theater where they became famous. And he thought that they were just they really had something special and new. He thought they were, and that's one of Lorne's talents. He can kind of figure out what the next thing coming down the pike is. I think they reminded him a little bit of Beyond the Fringe, the British uh, comedy troupe from Cambridge. And he just thought there was something utterly arresting and different about them. So he brought them to New York. He moved them all to New York, put them up in apartments, invested in them basically, and got them to play little nightclubs around New York for a year just to kind of season them. That's when I met them. That I was friends with them at that point was really interesting to see them undergoing this kind of polishing process. And then Lorne got them a deal with HBO and the CBC, which would, they were joint producing this series. And that was a fantastic show that ran for 5 years and won a bunch of Cable Ace Awards. And yeah, I think that they're really something special.
Yeah, yeah. So the Lauren Michael's management style, he's usually at first he was kind of hands off. Would you agree? In the
Well,
show?
I think that well, the thing that I think is interesting about his management style is that it's purely intuitive. He's never read a kind of management textbook, I think. And in the beginning, all of the other people at the show were his age, so it was a little weird even for him to feel like the boss because they were his peers. And he kind of let everyone fight everything out among themselves. As time has marched on and he's become more of a daddy figure, he he's both hands-on and hands-off. I mean, it's hard to explain, but definitely there are times when he can be very aloof and very remote and just sort of, one writer said to me, his style is, it's like he picks the horse, he lets it run the race. He doesn't micromanage. He likes people to feel ownership of their creative work. Um, but he does come in at the very end on Saturday night after he's watched the dress rehearsal and make some very, very decisive changes. That's the only time in the week when you'll see him really telling people, cut this, change that, put this here, you know, get her a different wig. Um, so I think it's more of a fluid thing. And he does manage different people with different styles. As Chris Rock told me, this guy has been thousands of people's boss. He's very good at zeroing in on what makes a certain person tick. And he'll he'll give each one the number of grains of sand as he or she needs. He's just very good at kind of getting the best out of people. And with some people that might be, with Bill Hader, for instance, who is prone to panic attacks. He told me that when he came back to host the show, he was just freaking out. And Lorne came into his dressing room and just said to him, pull yourself together, you're gonna be great. Just barked at him. And others talk about Lorne being, really quietly reassuring them with his eyes, as they're about to walk on stage. He seems to just sort of know what each person needs.
I my reaction to it's almost like he was an introvert. He's
An
an
introvert.
introvert. Introvert.
Oh, an introvert. Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
An
no. I
introvert.
think he is. He's gnomic in that, I mean, yes, I've just been saying he tells a lot of stories and he talks a lot, but he is very inscrutable. And there are times when he plays his cards very close to the vest and he just doesn't say that much. He definitely believes that you say more with less, when it comes to talking to the talent. Um, and yeah, he wants them to find it for themselves. He'll give them little pointers along the way. But again, I think this derives from that experience at Laugh-In, where he didn't feel ownership over any of his work. He wants them to feel like I created this and it doesn't have a million other people's fingerprints on it.
Oh yeah, yeah. I just the way he you described how he would he's very careful about emotions, very
Yes,
careful about how much energy he would put into
right.
his emotional responses. That has sort of struck me as, hey, I can relate, or I know that feeling
Yeah,
as
no,
being
that's a good
true.
observation. I I think that as the years have gone by, there's almost a burden, a weight of how much gratitude. I mean, how much people project onto him. You know, he's responsible for so many people's success that it does sort of weigh on him. I mean, he told me that in the early years, you know, John Belushi would show up in his office, in his lobby, in his building lobby at 3:30 in the morning, you know, needing to talk or something. And he's learned over the years that you have to have boundaries. You know, you have to keep some distance. Um, I think it's also a management tool, you know, it keeps them
Oh, yeah.
wanting to please him.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, you got to survive. He survived in the job. Is
Yes.
that's how you do it.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's wrap up with this question. How long is he going to stay at the job?
Well, I think that he's never going to leave. I think the job is his life. He loves it. You know, he's been doing it for so long, and he's never ever missed a Saturday night. You know, he's never had the stomach flu. He's always there. I think he would be so sad and lonely without it. Not that he doesn't have plenty of leisure interests, but I don't think he's going to walk away from it. I have a theory or a suggestion that rather than replace him, something could happen whereby he just comes into the office on Wednesday afternoon and Saturday evening. Those are the 2 days when I think his taste is essential. On Wednesday, there's a read through where 4 hours worth of sketches are read aloud by the cast. And then Lorne and his team of deputies will sort of winnow those down to about 10 or 12 that they're going to move forward with. And then on Saturday, he watches the dress rehearsal and has a million notes and a million cuts and changes. And those are the times when he puts his stamp on the show. And I think if you know, even into his 90s, if he could just come in for those few hours a week, his very able squad of deputies could do the rest, and it would still be his show. That's my theory.
Yeah, yeah, because I think the whole family, the family is created.
Right.
The that would probably keep him there.
Yeah,
One,
I don't think they want him to go. I don't think there's anybody saying, I wish this old guy would get out of here. He really is the beating heart of the place.
yeah, definitely. So, okay, we'll open up here for questions. I see at least one online. Here, yeah, yes, sir.
Yes, Ms. Morrison, thank you for your time speaking with us tonight. I have a question of how the President Schlosser discovered Lorne Michaels, because you said at that time he was really kind of unknown. And then
Yes.
for this young guy, 90 minutes live on a major television show is quite a risk. How did that really come about?
Well, it came about, Lorne was in LA working for these schlocky shows that I've described, and he kept pitching an idea to middle-aged executives for a show that was very like SNL, you know, young people, rock music, comedy, and nobody would listen to him. And then he met a young guy named Dick Ebersol, who was even younger than Lorne was. And Ebersol worked for Herb Schlosser at NBC. And and the reason they needed to put a show on at 11:30 on Saturday night is because Johnny Carson had a rerun of The Tonight Show used to run in that slot. And suddenly Carson, who was NBC's biggest star, of course, said, take the rerun off Saturday night. I want to put an extra rerun on during the week so I can take another day off. So suddenly Schlosser had this hole to fill. And so he said to Dick Ebersol, who was young and cool, find me a show that we can put on in that hour. And Dick had run into Lorne in LA and knew that he had this idea for kind of a cool show that would be more appealing to young people than most of what was on television. And Schlosser just immediately liked Lorne and said, okay, this is the guy. Let's do it.
Hey, anybody else right here? Question? So, was there anything that surprised you? Did you have a preconceived? Well, I mean, had a knowledge of Lorne and a lot of people around it, but did you find something that surprised you during your writing a book.
Well, I mean, two things. I mean, one thing, just like a character attribute, which I found very charming, is, Lorne knows legions of famous people and he has lots and lots of very famous friends. And a lot of the people who make fun of him around the office make fun of him for, he's always talking about Mick and Paul and Jack. But I think it's kind of interesting and almost endearing that at this age, having achieved all the things he's achieved, he still is kind of excited by celebrity. He told me that he saves on his phone all the voicemail messages that he gets from Paul McCartney. I mean, I would do that, but I'm just me. The idea that he saves his voicemails from Paul McCartney was adorable to me. Another thing that surprised me, and this is just a biographical incident, is that when the offer finally came to do SNL, when Herb Schlosser said to Dick Ebersol, get this guy into New York, we'll do that show. Lorne almost said no because he had grown to love California. It was warmer than Canada where he grew up. He had grown to love the beach and the desert. And he thought that he really embraced what he called California's, the way California valued fun as something not to be scoffed at. He liked the fact that in LA you could watch an Elvis Presley movie and read Chekhov, and those two things didn't seem anomalous. He thought New York was kind of pretentious. It was also 1974, 1975 in New York when the city was about to declare bankruptcy. The crime was up. Anyone who's seen Taxi Driver knows what I'm talking about. So it took a real effort of will for him to decide to give up California and come to New York. And if he hadn't, we would not have this show.
Yeah, definitely. Well, let's take a look at online. Uh, what was the hardest part about writing the book?
Well, I think it's, you know, a normal biographical subject, right, has friends and family who you interview and um, you talk to all of those people and get a lot of material. Lorne, if you think about it, every season of SNL has, let's say 10, a dozen, 10 to 20 writers, a whole bunch of cast members. There's a lot of turnover in those people. So I really wanted to talk to all of them. So this is a guy, and not only am I talking to him about 50 times, but he has a little army of people running along next to him. And so to talk to all of them, there was hundreds of people, was a huge research effort. It really took a long time. And I mean, they're all articulate and funny, and I'm really glad I talked to all of them, but it just made the research very deep.
Yeah, but it shows. It shows in the book. So let's take a look at the online, maybe for one more. Let's see. Oh, yeah, you mentioned Dick Ebersol. Maybe talk quickly about the new show and what
Oh, sure.
Lorne did between 80 and 80.
Yeah. Well, Lorne left SNL after the first 5 years. He was completely burned out, and they had been working really hard, and a lot of his key cast members had left: Belushi, Aykroyd, Chevy Chase, and he just wanted a break. So he thought that then he was going to start on the movie part of his career. He always wanted to direct The Graduate, so he wanted to go make movies. That didn't really pan out. It didn't play to his strengths. It turned out that the thing that really works for Lorne, his secret weapon, is the deadline. He often says SNL doesn't go on because it's ready. It goes on because it's 11:30. He needs the deadline. And movies are these vast, open-ended projects that have a million people weighing in with notes. So that didn't really work. And after a few years, NBC asked him if he wanted to come back and do another show, and they had a prime time slot available. So that's what he did, and he called it the New Show. Even though it wasn't new at all, it was really the same formula as SNL. It was hosts, sketches, and music, and there was huge talent on the show. John Candy was on a lot of them. There were great, great musical acts, a fantastic writer's room. I think that one of the reasons the show didn't work, it got canceled after 9 or 10 weeks, is that it was hosted by three people, Buck Henry, who is a genius, of course, and Dave Thomas and Valerie Bromfield, two Canadian comics. But they were, in their 40s, they were a little bit bland. They didn't really carry it. And if you think about the original cast of SNL, they were these dynamic young people. They were a little ethnic. And we think of Gilda and Belushi. And this trio was, I remember, I worked at that show and I was 23 and I remember thinking, it's kind of beige. It just didn't work. And anyway, it did teach Lorne that that what he wanted to do was SNL, and so that's why 2 years later he went back to SNL, and here we are today. So,
Well, one more.
okay,
Lorne, I wanted to target a young audience, but most young people weren't home on Saturday night. And the other thing I remember, it wasn't cool to watch TV back in the 70s.
no, that's right. The executives originally said no cool young people will be home at Saturday night. This show will never work. But Herb Schlosser prevailed. And one of the reasons that he knew it was working is that his own teenage son, Eric Schlosser, who would later become famous writing a fantastic book called Fast Food Nation, Eric and all his high school friends would always go to the show. So, no, but what they didn't count on is, I was a teenager then. I was watching the show in my basement with my friends. Young people were happy to have some cool thing to do all together at 11:30 at night, but the middle-aged executives didn't see that at first. So, again, Lorne was right.
Well,
Well, I remember after it caught on, like after that first year, they'd get together, have pop parties and watch the show to make sure they're home.
Right. That's right. That's what we did.
They look forward to it, yeah.
Yeah, the NBC affiliate here in Detroit didn't carry it for the
Oh.
first couple seasons. So they foisted off on the UHF channel.
Oh my. Huh.
So, but anyways, thank you very much, Susan.
Oh, this was a pleasure. Really nice talking to you.
Really enjoyed talking with you. Best of luck with your book. And I would encourage all Saturday Night Live fans to, if you're a fan, get this book. So thank you very much, Susan, and have a good night.
Thanks a lot. Good night. Thank you.